Hello and welcome. Today in this video we are going to talk about the possible invasion of Taiwan by China and its consequences. And for that we have for the second time on this topic Benjamin Blinder. Hello.
Hello, Xavier Titleman. Thanks for joining us for the fifth time.
We made that first video about 2 years ago because things have changed quite drastically in recent years. And I almost feel like this would be the optimal time for China to take action. The Americans are busy in the Gulf, they're even redirecting their resources to that area. And China, it keeps preparing, it's gaining strength.
That's exactly right. So for about 20 years now, and it's no secret, China has been modernizing and expanding its navy. And so that involves replacing old units with more modern versions. For frigates, corvettes, destroyers, cruisers, and of course the most iconic elements, assault helicopter carriers and aircraft carriers.
Regarding aircraft, that's a known weakness for them, especially compared to the United States and regional allies. So now, in terms of technological capability and scale, is it starting to get serious?
So they talk about it a lot. We have stealth or semi-stealth fighters, we have loyal wingmen or something similar. So it's interesting actually because we have these completely modern aspects and at the same time they're converting several thousand-old jet planes from the 1950s and 60s into drones, which could be used for massive strike waves. A low-cost option against Taiwan.
Okay, the rise of Chinese power. When we talked about it 4 or 5 years ago, we said they were incapable of winning a conventional war before, I don't know, 2035. Do you think the timeline has shortened? There were detailed war games, or does it still seem far off given how much they're producing?
So we do have that famous date of 2027 that was announced by the admiral heading in DOPACOM. Personally, I don't believe in 2027. I'm looking more at a timeline of 2032 to 2035. And that can be explained for a whole bunch of reasons, but the first is that today they don't have enough ships, in any case for amphibious operations, which they would need to guarantee the success of an invasion of Taiwan. So there are dozens of barges, there are transport ships, landing craft, and so on. All of that is already important. It's a start, but from my point of view, they don't have the numbers. Then if we look at the scenarios from the Pentagon or the CSIS think tank, they are more focused on that. Either a forceful invasion of Taiwan, that's more the Pentagon's view. And for CSIS, we're looking at scenarios involving embargoes, blockades, or even floating minefields around Taiwan. So I don't criticize these three scenarios as such, I just think they're not the right scale. That is, they focus on the main island of Taiwan. And personally, I wrote an article with KIMS, the Korea Institute of Mining Strategy, where I say that actually this would be perfect for the Taiwanese islands closest to the mainland, Kinmen, Wuchu, and Matsu. And there we set up a complete blockade and don't fire a single shot, we just wait for them to fall, out of water, food, or energy. And we can seize them without a fight. And besides, that's a scenario we can repeat with the two islands that Taiwan has in the South China Sea, Pratas and Ituaba. And then maybe, why not later, with the Penghu Islands. In the end, maybe there's no need to send anyone to Taiwan.
Because actually retaking all these little islands scattered around that we don't know about. Actually, when we're in France, are you based there? But that means that by nibbling away like this, it proves that no one is able to come support Taiwan. Because actually there are two wars, there is the war. To dominate the sea against Taiwan and its allies, the United States, Japan, and possibly South Korea, there are many unanswered questions. And secondly, there's the landing capability. So you're assuming the idea is that taking control of some small islands, recapturing some small islands, would be proof that, in the end, Taiwan's allies are not ready to support it.
That's exactly right. That is to say, launching a full-scale attack against Taiwan's main island seems pretty complicated if you don't control the areas closest to China. And in fact, they serve as bases for advanced sensors. So that's where we have radars, observation stations, and maybe even electronic warfare stations. And actually taking these islands and on top of that without firing a shot would deprive Taiwan of those sensors, advance and improve its own positions, ensuring an enhanced element of surprise. Psychologically speaking, it means humiliating the political and military authorities of Taiwan 2 or 3 times in a row before even considering an attack. And so it could maybe, you never know, lead to a psychological, moral, and political collapse of the authorities.
Last time we talked about quite a few things, the means of hybrid warfare, which ranged from putting cyanide in coral reefs to prevent fishermen from working, to creating these barges. Have their methods expanded today, or have they become more widespread?
They have both expanded and become more widespread, so in both ways. So we often hear about this expression of the three wars: political war, legal war, and communication war. But actually, that's just a small part of what I call asymmetric warfare. And this term actually includes the combination of access denial, hybrid warfare, and gray zone techniques. So today I have a list. I keep track of all this. I've listed 300 different techniques used by China to push forward its advantages. And typically we were talking about the lethal aspects. There's a whole dimension, actually 80% of the spectrum is non-lethal, and which will include, for example, right now, the gradual deployment, in addition to the lethal means, of buoys, some of which are up to 15 meters in diameter, covered with sensors on the surface and below the surface. We also have drones of quite a few different types. We have floating platforms. For example, we've seen floating radars and giant landing barges around Hainan. Also, the authorities are communicating about the mobilization of civilian resources. They say they can mobilize up to 6,000 flat-bottom cargo ships, which they can convert into artillery platforms with tanks, MLRS, and so on. And we even have offshore platforms. You have to imagine the size. Decommissioned, used as a marker of sovereignty along the border with Japan, to gradually encroach on and contest its neighbors' borders.
So here, concretely, it's not yet open aggression in the sense that they're not openly trying to invade, but the act of pushing out maritime boundaries is already an operational reality today. Are they also contesting the access of countries in the region to their own territorial waters, the Philippines, Indonesia, etc.? Are the Chinese trying to push them out of their own waters?
Things have happened gradually. You should know that China first contested the borders of 100% of its neighbors, both on land and at sea. Even Russia, even North Korea had to give in, either through unequal negotiations, the use of force, or the threat of using force. And in the same way, we see Chinese villages appearing in Bhutan, Nepal, and at the border with Central Asia. More or less everywhere like that, and it's also happening at sea with those famous buoys and drones, etc. In fact, it's there to play with international maritime law. That is, according to UNCLOS, you can peacefully conduct scientific research in the territorial waters of your neighbors. Well, maybe not the territorial waters, but the exclusive economic zone, or at sea, or in the high seas. Then there are good practices to follow. You announce where you are going to do your research, when it will start and end, what the nature of the research is, and what means will be used. That's part of good practices, except that China doesn't declare anything, doesn't ask for anything, and sets up its ships or its drones or its buoys, does whatever it wants to do, and then, if it decides, leaves. And that's clearly a problem, because if it keeps doing that, and if none of its neighbors actually dares to either capture its buoys or push them back or destroy them, well, new norms will be created on the ground against which it will no longer be possible to fight afterwards.
But there are some who dare to destroy or capture its buoys, or really for now they don't even dare to react?
Exactly, that's the real problem. None have dared to do it. Even Japan, which is a powerful, wealthy country with an extremely powerful coast guard, more than 150 ships and some up to 30,000 tons, well, even Japan didn't dare to touch it. For example, there was a buoy placed near Okinawa Torishima. There are several others next to the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. Tokyo didn't dare to touch a single one. They kept asking China, please, would you kindly take back your buoy? So they went through the hotline, they went through the embassy, they went through contacts from military to military. In any case, it took more than a month for Beijing to finally agree to do it. But one of the reasons is that officially it's not the Chinese army, it's not the Chinese Coast Guard. It's not the maritime militia either that deployed these assets. These are research vessels affiliated with universities, so officially it's not the Chinese government.
Can you give a sort of rundown of China's current operational military capabilities? How many ships they have, specifically combat ships?
Well, that's some information. Thank you very much for this question. It helps clarify a lot of things. That's what we always hear. China has 400 ships, so on paper it's true there are 400 ships. But if you separate the ocean-going ships from the coastal ships, actually, it's 200 and 200, it's 50 and 50. And so that doesn't make China a paper tiger. But when you go from an image of 400 heavy ships to 200 already, we're not talking about the same scale anymore. By the way, these 200 ships, like all the navies in the world, are subject to the 4 cycles of the Navy: repairs and maintenance, training, operational preparation, and deployment. So here, again, we go from 200 to maybe 100 or 120 ships at most available at any given time. And these ships, they're not like the FREMS, where we have a double crew. Most Chinese ships spend 2/3 of their time in port, while for us it's 2/3 of our time at sea. For China then, in the end, we end up with 400 ships, including 200 blue water ships. The Coast Guard has 150 ships, and the maritime militia. It's estimated that up to 8,000 industrial fishing trawlers can be mobilized.
What would these trawler ships do? Just act as targets? Or can they actually do something? Do they launch missiles like the Iranians?
Well, no, the Chinese trawlers don't fire missiles. That being said, from some contacts I have at the IRCM and FMS in Toulon, I know that these ships can be equipped with jamming systems for signals or GPS. There are weapon caches for RPGs, SAM systems, or AK-47S. They can have reinforced hulls and a number of things like that. And above all, they are used for what is called, in English, power projection, that is force projection, or for intelligence purposes, for example. And by the way, so here we were talking about the militarized auxiliaries, which are the Coast Guard and the maritime militia. But we have a whole range of civilian auxiliaries who have been shown to also project influence, project force, or gather intelligence. And here I'll mention them quickly. But that includes hospital ships, icebreakers, intelligence ships, some research vessels, and some cruise ships. And that's the 8,000 ships of the maritime militia.
Well, actually, is it China that's inspired by Russia, or is it Russia that's inspired by China, or are they all moving forward at the same pace? Because what you're describing is exactly what Russia does by putting listening systems on cargo ships that pass by, cutting cables with the civilian ship registered in the Caribbean, and so on. So which way is it going then?
The Russians, for their part, were really focused on submarine forces. That was their big thing during the Cold War in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and even today. China is really using platforms where it's not so easy to determine in advance whether they're aggressive or not. And typically here we had an incident, what I would call an incident. Several weeks ago, we saw a completely standard container ship. It looked in every way like a container vessel. And we realized that the container ships were actually carrying missile silos, and that the ship had 2 kinds of 30mm Gatling guns flare launchers, more than 60 missile tubes, and over-the-horizon radars. That's a lot for a cargo ship. And alongside that, we saw military-grade lasers on the roofs of civilian ships. We saw cargo ships turned into artillery platforms, with cannons, self-propelled guns, tanks, or MLRs. That, for once, is truly unique. We've never seen anything like that anywhere else in China.
So, for example, the Russians have promoted the Club K, which is also a missile that's actually inside a cargo container, a civilian container. You can't tell the difference. Ships and cargo vessels pass off France's coast. Potentially, there are containers that turn into missile launchers. There could be Shahed drones on board and so on. And the Iranians have also launched ballistic missiles from containers. So, in the end, I think this Russia-China-Iran axis is strengthening each other, and they share bad ideas or good ideas depending on your point of view.
There is clearly what we could call cross-fertilization, a cross-pollination between these countries. But on the Russian and Iranian side, it's more about prototyping, while on the Chinese side, it's really about deployment and industrialization.
Here, we're really talking about the ability to win the naval war in order to then carry out a landing, but now you're talking about the Chinese on the other side. Are they moving, preparing, defending themselves? Or maybe they're already doing it and we're just forbidding ourselves. What's illegal? That is, it's illegal to arm civilian ships or to use them in that way. It's illegal under maritime law. The Chinese do it, so let's say that since we're nice, we follow the law, and as a result, we fall behind.
So maybe I'll start with Taiwan, since I'm a researcher in Taiwan this year as part of the Taiwan Fellowship. Now, it turns out that Taiwan isn't just sitting idly by. Granted, the United States is about 10 years behind on some deliveries, but we've seen that Taiwan is about to confirm a new $14 billion order for various equipment. We've seen Abrams tanks, the M1A2Ts, which have finally started being delivered, and there's clearly a big trend for drones. So, Why is that? You might know that there have been Ukrainian delegations visiting Taiwan and the Philippines as well. And somewhat surprisingly, Taiwanese manufacturers don't seem too eager to give up a share of the drone market. And we even see Taiwanese delegations going to Ukraine to try to sell drones to the Ukrainian armed forces.
They also have naval drones.
Naval and aerial drones, but here, I believe it's mainly about the aerial segment. So there are loitering munitions, surface drones, underwater drones, and aerial drones. It's really an important avenue right now. You've probably also heard about the launch of Taiwan's domestically built submarine, as well as the kinds of catamarans or trimarans, well, warships of that type, which have also been launched. So, those are some areas of interest, okay?
Still no deterrence in sight for Taiwan, because, let me remind you, in the 1970s it was a nuclear program. They were very close to succeeding, and the Americans told them, no, you don't need nuclear weapons, don't worry. There's a rule that says a non-nuclear country can't be attacked with an atomic bomb. It was a diplomatic rule. I want to say, they're not going back on that.
So, in principle, no, we're not going back. No, not back. That being said, there are all sorts of rumors going around about a site, about a construction project. So, a hypersonic Taiwanese missile that would target the Three Gorges Dam. Now, I can't say whether that exists or doesn't exist. However, I've heard enough buzz about it and enough corroborating sources to think it's real. In terms of equipment,
We're discussing millions of deaths here. If the Three Gorges Dam fails, entire massive valleys would be affected.
behind the Three Gorges Dam, if it gives way,
Some valleys are enormous. What about other countries? Do we know for sure? Do we have defense agreements? With the United States, yes, but with Donald Trump, nothing is ever certain. Would Japan, South Korea, India, I don't know, who could come to support Taiwan if there was some kind of attempt?
So that's the big issue, since we know there are ties that are growing stronger, or at least ongoing, between the Philippines, for example, and Taiwan, or between Japan and Taiwan. Saying that they would officially go fight the Chinese to protect Taiwan, that's another matter. That being said, it's in their national security interest not to allow Taiwan to be taken over by China. That's absolutely clear to everyone. The Japanese have clearly made significant efforts. I believe they're intentionally not sharing much about it, and I think that's wise. But 2 helicopter carriers converted into aircraft carriers, orders for F-35's Type 12 anti-ship missiles, with their range extended from 200 to 1,000 kilometers. Creation of interceptor missile stations in the southern Ryukyus, and they also have advanced radars. No, Japan is doing the job, honestly. And now I think we're about to get some news. New interpretations of the Constitution that allow for an even broader range of defense cooperation.
And South Korea?
Well, in this case, South Korea, it's really, we don't hear anything. So we know that they're modernizing their fleet, their air force. The KF-21 Boramae is currently in development. Well, I can't elaborate more than that. But they have the ambition, they've made it official, to have submarines with ballistic missile launch capabilities and maybe even arsenal ships. That was part of the official Navy programs just 2 or 3 years ago.
They're ramping up without clearly stating their doctrine, but basically it should be able to exert at least deterrent pressure on China, thinking that maybe the Koreans will join in as well.
So I feel like the closer a country is to China, the less it officially announces its defense programs. In any case, one thing is certain. The withdrawal of the THAAD batteries from South Korea was definitely not ignored by the country's military authorities, and it didn't go over very well.
Obviously. So let's just recall this. The Americans, because of their magnificent war in Iran, have withdrawn a number of resources from all over the world. They stopped the flow of support to Ukraine, they withdrew defensive military equipment they had on the Korean Peninsula and in the Asia-Pacific region, in general. That's why I asked earlier if this is the right time for the Chinese. So, it's not appreciated, but nevertheless, it may not be enough for China to gain the upper hand. Yes.
So that's also why we were talking about alternative scenarios, like taking the small islands near China first instead of the main island. Do these scenarios help to minimize negative repercussions as much as possible, politically, diplomatically, economically, in all areas? Whereas if there were a full-scale attack against Taiwan, according to various think tanks, but also according to Bloomberg, we would be looking at a minimum of 3 to 4 weeks of operations, potentially up to 6 months, And so we're talking about up to 6 months of blockade. No civilian ship or civilian plane could cross the strait, either by sea or by air, and that would have absolutely devastating economic consequences. So, in the context of the purges, we know that Xi Jinping ended up sacrificing his closest friend, who was the head of the Central Military Commission, because this friend had strongly discouraged him from launching a military operation against Taiwan after what he wanted to do in 2024.
All right, so there are political signals of aggressiveness from the Chinese government.
From Xi Jinping, but obviously part of the Chinese high command is not in favor of this scenario.
Okay, here we talked about the situation of war, of direct confrontation, just in case. They needed to establish naval dominance in order to then carry out such a landing. At the time, I made a video about these war games, which showed that the Chinese didn't have enough landing capability to bring hundreds of thousands of men quickly enough to win a ground battle in Taiwan. Where do we stand on that today?
Well, that's absolutely true. I mean, they have an army of 1.3 million men, that's the first thing. But out of those 1.3 million, some would have to be kept back at the border with India, with Bhutan, Nepal, etc. Basically, the different countries that surround China. So that's the first thing about the manpower then regarding the equipment. As I mentioned earlier, they have a certain number of ships, but they don't have enough ships to land entire Army Corps. Especially since the crossing can take 12 hours each way, 12 hours during which you can easily imagine rockets, missiles, loitering munitions, naval mines, and possibly even underwater mines. So it would be anything but a walk in the park. And in terms of landing forces, the Chinese Marine Corps consists of 40,000 people, including 20,000 active and 20,000 reservists. It's the same for the airborne forces, it's the same for the air assault forces. So it's not so much a problem of firepower in terms of missiles, rockets, etc. I think the Chinese Navy, as well as the Air Force and the strategic rocket forces, totally have the potential to do what's next. What do we do once we've destroyed the defenses or have actually softened them up enough? And that's where the problem lies. The problem isn't about manpower or about the means to transport the troops. Today,
does China have sufficient means, and is it developing them in particular to try to succeed in this landing?
well, the amphibious forces are clearly the favored part within the Navy. But, and this is less well known, the Army and the Coast Guard have been tasked with developing their own landing capability. So I'll let our audience imagine the organizational complexity that would entail. And on top of all that, well, we have these Ro-Ros, the giant roll-on roll-off ships. We have the 6,000 barges, and we have the barges with the lifting legs that I mentioned earlier. On the other hand, it's a bit all over the place. We're not really sure if it's about communication, appearances, or if it's competition between security actors, or if they're really trying to develop a capability.
But these floating ports you're showing, what are they for? Actually, it's a bit like what we saw with Overlord during the Normandy landings. Yeah.
It's a set of barges that range from 110 meters up to 185 meters. They're equipped with lifting legs to allow them to adapt to high tide and low tide, and they're fitted with giant ramps. And actually, when you line up 3 barges in a row like Legos, you almost reach a kilometer in length. And this artificial port can accommodate up to 6 roll-on, roll-off ships side by side to unload men, equipment, ammunition, and vehicles. And so I want to add a caveat because it might look very impressive in photos. But actually, these are barges that have no roof, no defense system, and are extremely fragile throughout the entire time, during transit, assembly, and disembarkation. So that would mean that to use them, they would need total or near total supremacy in the air and at sea. And that's not obvious.
All right, I have one last question, maybe a silly one, but in the end, cutting off access to oil from the Middle East and Venezuela, which is basically what Donald Trump is doing, isn't that also a way to put pressure on China and prevent them from attempting any truly offensive action in the region?
Well, I was asked about this same question a few days ago, in connection actually with the fact that there has been a complete stop to violations of the ADZ and the airspace of Taiwan by Chinese forces due to a lack of flights. It started again yesterday, so there you go, we're not sure there's a connection. Next, if we focus on what we've seen in the South China Sea and in Vietnam, for example, China, if oil and gas were so important for its national security, at least from this area actually, we would have seen them exploit it, but they have done absolutely nothing in this region. On the other hand, they created the Myanmar corridor, the Pakistani corridor. They invested in Yamal LNG in Siberia. They financed the Power of Siberia 1 pipeline. And now they have just signed, or they are in the process of signing for the second one. So there you have it. Everything leads me to believe that China has the means to get by with at least several weeks or months of strategic reserves, and they're not necessarily in a state of fragility that's too strong.
That's important. Incidentally, they're still taking quite a bit of advantage of Russia's weakened situation, let's say, by making Russia pay for the pipelines themselves, by making Russia pay transportation fees through Mongolia, and by getting decades-long discounts of 30% on oil prices. I heard these are unbelievable numbers. So,
in fact, when the invasion of Crimea happened, in 2014, China provided a $400 billion lifeline to Russia in exchange for a guaranteed price at a 30% discount for several decades, so what you're saying is absolutely verified. And now I'm afraid that with Power of Siberia 2, the bargaining power is more on Beijing's side than Moscow's.
once again, well, are we staying positive about the coming years or not so much?
I'd say at least 5 years right now, Xi Jinping isn't in a strong position. There have been purges, the economy is struggling, and there are serious structural issues, which, for me, in my opinion, makes me think that there is really very, very little chance that 2027 will become a reality. By the way, it's worth noting that the Americans, yesterday or the day before, also confirmed that the 2027 scenario is no longer credible. So for me, I'm really looking ahead to 2032, 2035 as, let's say, maybe not a certainty, but a window of opportunity that seems most likely.
We'll add all the links in this video's comments so people can check out your work. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you very soon.
Thank you.